All right, Walter, why don't we start with our first beer? What do we have here?
Hey everyone, Walter Brown here, doing Flights of Fancy, of course, and this is Gravity Road from Forgotten Boardwalk, and it's an Imperial Stout. It's one of my favorites from them. It's heavy. I mean, it's 10%. So if you love Guinness, you might want to take the next step to creamy, luscious. This clocks in at a double Guinness.
So what would you rate it, Walt?
I think I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 on Untapped.
Well, it's definitely creamy. It has a little bit of a bitter back end to it. But it does go down smooth enough. I like the APV. You know, I like the high APV.
Right. I mean,
I'd give this a 4.
A 4?
Yeah.
And so, a nice stout goes well with our story of Iron John. You know,
yes.
Iron and strength and stouts and...
All right, so let's talk about Iron John. So this is where we're going to discuss the book that we're talking about today, which is Iron John, a book about men by the poet Robert Bly. So before we get too far into that, why don't we talk about, Walt, when in your life, because we pretty much discovered this book at the same time. I don't know if I turned you onto it or you turned me onto it.
It was 1990 when it was published.
Right. So what point in your life did this book hit you at?
It's 1990. I'm working hard at the Holiday Inn. I'm commuting to college. I really don't know what I want to do. When I read Iron John, I realized, wait a second, I don't want to be the kid that throws up at freshman orientation because I didn't want to leave home, true story, and go to an overnight orientation at Rowan. So I didn't go because I was so nervous. And so when I read this book, and I'm like, wait a second here. I need to leave the kingdom. So what did I do? I went to California, went up and down the West Coast on a train, and then I went over to Europe to study. And it was like, you went from like being so protected at home to now being so much into a hero's journey where lots of crazy things happened to me.
I think I read it a little bit later than you then, because I know when I read it, Stephen, my son, was already born. So that was, 91. I was in a relationship with my wife, to be, which we got married in 95. And I was at a pivotal point in my life where I had just finished college. My job prospects weren't that great, and I was becoming a father, like right out of the gate. And it was nerve-wracking for me. And even though I didn't come from a divorced home and I had a great relationship with my father, I still don't think I understood in my mind what it meant to, one, be a father, and two, even be a good man. So I stumbled upon this book, actually with my dad. I remember we were shopping at the Berlin Cultural Center, and there was the book guy out back, and we picked this up, and I instantly fell in love with it. And at that time, I didn't really understand much about I was an English major, so I did understand the mythopoetic theory that, you can look back at these myths through time and these archetypes through time, and they can teach you about yourselves in ways that if you take the time to try to tease out that symbolism could be very meaningful to you. And I remember around the same time I discovered this, I read Campbell on a Hero of a Thousand Faces. And I don't know if it was in there or in some other reading I did, but they talked about the Chickenhawk Experiment by this guy, German Honroth, in 1939. Had these chickens in a yard, and he noticed that whenever a goose would fly over the farm, the chickens would just ignore it. But whenever a bird with a shorter neck, a chicken hawk, would fly over the yard, the chickens, even though they were just fresh out of the eggs, would instinctively hide with their mothers. And the theory was must be some sort of encoding, some sort of thing that happens because they weren't being trained to do this. It's just naturally as soon as they come out of the shell. And so they designed a experiment a few years later in 1939 where they created a wooden chicken hawk. And they flew that Chickenhawk over the yard, and sure enough, even though they just had like pieces of shell still on their little tails, they ran for cover as soon as they saw the Chickenhawk, instinctively knowing it was bad. Then they did the same thing, and they threw the Chickenhawk backwards, the wooden Chickenhawk backwards over the farmyard. You know what the chickens did? Nothing.
They didn't care.
They didn't do anything because
This
they
is not-
they knew Chickenhawks couldn't
Do that.
do that. They couldn't fly backwards, even though they were never taught that. And the whole theory is there are certain things that we know instinctually to be true. And these fairy tales, this mythopoetic approach, looks at that and says, okay, you look at this fairy tale, these archetypes, they're going to ring true for you today as they would for your ancestors hundreds of years ago.
Right. I grew up really without a religion. I was baptized Catholic. My pores were too dense, so the holy water didn't take. Ha ha ha! Funny, I say that joke all the time. It doesn't get any funnier.
No.
And I was raised Presbyterian for like a summer. And
now that's funny.
That's funny. Right?
That's a good line.
That's a good line. Thank you. But I was like, it's like I reread recently Carl Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and I have all these notes in there because in graduate school, I was studying archetypal criticism and comparative religion, comparative literature, and I just loved it. And how could stories like a flood story or the cross or a virgin birth story be similar, different names, right? Maybe some subtle differences, but how could it be the same in cultures that never met one another? Campbell was like, well, there's either two ways. They either had contact at some point, which they didn't, or what Carl Jung says was we're born with this collective unconscious, that we're born with this coding in us. And for someone who didn't have a religion and tended to be more like rational-minded and reasonable, this doesn't make any sense when I say this, but, because of my history. But, it's like a doubting Thomas. I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. But then I realized it's all symbolism. So millions and millions of people have died over symbols. So when I'm at church with my wife and daughters and I see Jesus up there, who I think is a great person to listen to, great stories, but I see him as a portal, right? I see him as a doorway, like Narnia, like a wardrobe, like a rabbit hole that can bring me into bliss or even to the sublime. But he says that religion often gets in the way of religious experience. We get caught up with dogma. We get caught up in the minutia of man's interpretation of prophets, but they forget that it's all symbol. But it's how you interpret it, right? It's like a story. You dream a story, and you're like the author of the story, but not really the author of the story. And then how do you? I started eating up this stuff after I read Iron John, and Dan and I would oftentimes, I would go to his work and I would bug Dan constantly about my social problems, but he would have like great advice that it's like the good advice you just can't take, Alanis Morissette. And I remember Dan, one of the best gifts I ever got was this like book of quotes. Half of them were from Dan, half of them for like Campbell and like Lazul or whoever. And if you had a question, you would raise the book to your head, ask the question, and then open it, and it would give you the answer. I always loved that. I still have it, and I have my students do that. And they just think, wow, but it's all interpretive, right? It's like, that's why I love fairy tales, because there's no author right there. There's no author that gets in the way.
Yeah, that came from Robert Bach's Messiah Handbook, which we probably should do that sometime as well. But let's get back to Iron John.
Okay.
So let's talk a minute about Robert Bly, give some credit there. So Robert Bly was a poet. Pretty big poet in the late 60s. I think he won like the Man Award for American Poetry or something of that nature around 1968. And then really found his popularity in the 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, leading these men experience groups. And it sounds as hippie-ish and corny as it actually was. There'd be... you would draw trees, you would bang on drums, you would wrestle with men naked in the dust and all this other stuff.
And, it's
Yeah. It was more of trying to recreate this initiation process that the mythopoetic movement felt was important and was missing from modern society.
Yes.
The theory being that, excuse me, as we progress through the industrial age into the corporate age, where we no longer see our fathers working in the fields or working in the mines, and they go off and work in office buildings, and we have no idea what their jobs are, and then they come home and we see them for an hour, and so we're pretty much raised by our mothers. Or in your case, where you have
our school systems.
Right.
Like D.H. Lawrence said, I was raised by a school system by women who, this is not to knock women, but men and women learn a little differently according to all the research, and I'm a teacher, so. But it's the idea that, it's like sitting for 6-7 hours drives anyone crazy.
Right. So the whole theory is, get more in touch with your manly side through these initiation processes. Mm-hmm. And to illustrate that, he came up with Iron John. And Iron John is really a fairy tale, very, very old fairy tale. Some call it Iron Hans in some instances, and I think in like the Hans Christian Andersen tradition.
It was Grimm, and it came out in 1826.
Right.
So it was codified in 1826 by the Grimm Brothers. They just went around Germany, Bavaria, collecting fairy tales that are thousands and thousands of years old. So it's almost like Yahweh, it's like God, or it's like whoever Shakespeare was or whoever Homer was. They just appeared, and so there's no author who can explicate and get in the way of these stories. It just appears out of nowhere, like cliff dwelling drawings.
So Robert Bly, the poet, recently died this year. I'm not quite sure the exact date.
About a month ago, in November?
December, November, somewhere around there. We were talking about it maybe in October, but it was this winter or fall. And Walt and I often talk about Iron John, bringing it up every now and then. And I said I always wanted to get back to it.
Yeah.
And now that he's passed away, it was time to get back and try to decide whether or not this approach and this story in particular, and Bly's approach to this story, actually holds up in today's world. I can tell you right now, throughout these flights, you and I are going to disagree a lot.
Really?
Yes. Revisiting this, I'm coming from a totally different view.
Really?
Yes, but we will talk about that.
Okay.
All right? So, try to save some of that for later.
I will.
Right now, we're going to move into our second flight, so we're going to pause right here.
I got
We're going to pause right here so you can pour the next flight.
Let me just take a nice, hopefully you can get a...
All right, we'll be right back.